The millionaire laughed when he saw his ex-wife enter the courtroom alone. No lawyer, no hope, only a worn-out folder and the dignity he thought he had destroyed. She had given everything, her money, her dreams, 10 years of silence, and he offered her only 2%, as if her life was worth nothing. But then the door opened. Slow steps. Firm. A 68-year-old woman entered as if that room belonged to her. And when Robert saw who it was, the world stopped spinning. It was his own mother, and she brought justice like this if it touched your soul. It's more than a click, and it's a silent hug between those who know what it's like to get up after falling. Comment how you think this story will end. And if you haven't subscribed yet, and it costs you nothing, but for us it means a lot. Thank you for being here. The New York sun fell hard on the windows of the family court, as if it wanted to expose every secret hidden behind those cold walls. Robert Miller adjusted the Rolex on his wrist with a mechanical gesture, almost ceremonial, while he walked through the marble hallway like someone entering his own territory. At 42, he had built a real estate empire that allowed him to walk through the world with the arrogance of someone who has never had to ask anyone for anything. 3 lawyers followed him like elegant shadows. Flawless Italian suits, leather briefcases that shone under the artificial light, shoes that echoed with authority on the polished floor. The lead lawyer, Dr. Stephen Vance, was known throughout the city for winning impossible cases and charging fortunes for it. His chiseled face and his perfectly combed back hair gave him the look of a movie actor playing a movie lawyer. "Do you think she will show up?" Vance asked, with that tone that mixed professionalism and a certain barely hidden contempt. Robert let out a short, dry laugh, full of disdain. Lucy was always stubborn as a mule. He stopped in front of a window and watched his own reflection in the dark glass. The smile that formed on his face was that of someone who already knows the end of the story. She thinks she can face me alone. After 10 years by my side, she still hasn't understood how the world works. Lucy Hayes. The name caused a strange mix of irritation and something like pity. He had met her when she was a simple supermarket cashier in a small town, 21 years old, and eyes full of impossible dreams. She wanted to study law. She talked about justice as if it was something real, as if people could change the world just by being good. How naive she had been. At first, that naivety seemed charming, even useful. A beautiful, humble, grateful woman. When his business started to grow, Robert did her the favor, that's how he saw it, as a favor, of convincing her to drop out of college. "Why study? You already have everything with me. I take care of everything." And she, in love, trusting, had believed him. She left her classes, her books, her ambitions. She became the perfect wife, smiling at business dinners, quiet when important men spoke, always flawless, always available. A beautiful ornament on the arm of a successful man. For years, Robert made her believe she was lucky, that he had rescued her from a mediocre life, that without him she would be nothing. It all ended the night she discovered him in Chicago, in a luxury hotel with his secretary. He didn't even have the decency to deny it. Why? The rules of the world were clear. Men like him could do whatever they wanted. Women like her should be grateful for what they received. When Lucy asked for a divorce, Robert offered her 2% of the assets. "Be reasonable, Lucy," he had told her, like someone explaining things to a little girl. "You contributed nothing. I built this alone." Now, walking toward the courtroom, Robert felt an almost physical satisfaction. Today it would all end. Today she would understand once and for all who was in charge. The room was a rectangular space with cream walls, lit by fluorescent tubes that gave everything an aspect of institutional coldness. There was something oppressive in that silence, in the way the wooden chairs creaked under the weight of bodies, in the smell of old paper and air conditioning. Robert sat with his 3 lawyers around him, like a general surrounded by his staff. They spread out folders, organized documents, whispered a few words. Everything was under control. Then she entered. Lucy Hayes crossed the door with slow steps, dressed in a dark grey skirt and a simple white blouse, her brown hair tied back in an unpretentious ponytail, her face without makeup, low-heeled shoes worn by use. She carried an old folder in her hands and no lawyer by her side. The contrast was brutal, almost obscene. Robert could not contain himself. The laugh came out with force, echoing through the room like a loud slap. "No lawyer, Lucy." His voice was loaded with mockery, with anticipated victory. "Seriously? This is going to be faster than I thought." The judge, a man with a tired face and grey hair who had seen hundreds of marriages die in that same room, hit the gavel on the table. "Order! Miss Hayes, where is your legal representation?" Lucy looked up slowly. There was no fear in her eyes. There was something firmer, deeper. "She will arrive, Your Honor." Robert rolled his eyes, impatient. "Sure. She must have hired some street lawyer. Can we start already? I don't want to waste my afternoon here." And then the door opened. The steps were first. Slow, measured, firm. The sound of someone who doesn't need to hurry to prove anything. The woman who entered the room was 68 years old, but her presence made time seem irrelevant. She wore a perfectly cut charcoal grey suit, discreet but flawless high heels, her grey hair pulled back in a neat bun. Thin-framed glasses rested on her nose with the authority of someone who has read thousands of files and issued rulings that changed lives. She carried a black leather executive briefcase, worn by years of use but cared for with dedication. There was nothing flashy about her, but everything in her way of moving, of holding her gaze, of occupying the space, spoke of power. A power earned with decades of work, study, and legal battles. Robert's lawyers, who until then were relaxed, straightened their backs without realizing it. Dr. Vance turned slightly pale. Even the judge changed his expression, recognizing something in that figure who had just entered. Robert felt the air escape his lungs. The world seemed to stop for an eternal second. "Mom?" The word came out as a choked whisper, as if saying it out loud could make all this real. Dr. Helen Miller, his own mother, former Superior Court judge, respected jurist in the whole country, author of 3 books on matrimonial law taught in law schools. A woman whose reputation spanned decades. When Helen Miller took a case, someone ended up destroyed. And she never forgave cowards. Helen walked to where Lucy was, and, without asking anyone's permission, placed a hand on her shoulder. It was not a gesture of affection. It was protection. It was a declaration of war. "Good morning, Robert." Helen's voice was cold, controlled, lethal. "I represent Ms. Hayes in this process." The silence that followed was so deep it seemed to have weight. You could feel the tension, almost touch it. Dr. Vance exchanged a quick look with his colleagues. They all knew exactly who Helen Miller was and what it meant to face her. Robert tried to speak, but the words got stuck in his throat. "Mom, you can't." Helen turned her face toward him, and it was like facing a mirror without mercy. "I can, and I will." She opened the briefcase calmly, without hurry, and pulled out a folder. "Your Honor, I present evidence demonstrating my client's substantial contribution to the building of the marital assets, as well as evidence of asset hiding and financial fraud." Robert let out a weak, desperate laugh. Contribution? She didn't even work. Helen picked up a document and placed it on the judge's table with the precision of someone placing a bullet on a surface. His wife contributed $80,000 from her own savings before marrying as an initial investment in his first project in New Jersey. She paused, letting the words settle. "Here is the loan agreement that you signed and never paid." Robert's face lost all color. A sickly white covered his cheeks. The kind of white that appears when the body understands that something terrible is about to happen. Helen continued, with that devastating calm that characterized her. "Additionally, I have emails where you admit that Lucy reviewed your company's contracts because she had an eye for finding traps. She saved you from clauses that would have cost you millions. I have witnesses. I have dates. I have documents." Dr. Vance tried to lean in to whisper something to Robert, but he wasn't listening. The world was collapsing around him, and neither all his money nor his ego could stop it. Helen took another envelope from the folder and placed it on the table with the same serenity of someone reading a sentence in public. And finally, her voice lowered in volume, but somehow the whole room heard her perfectly. I have recordings where you tell investors that Lucy was the brain behind the financial decisions. Do you want me to play them here?" Robert's jaw trembled. He gripped the arm of the chair until his knuckles turned white. It was true. All of it was true. On nights where he pretended to be the genius, he ran to Lucy to ask her what to do. He always knew she was smarter than him. He just never could stand the thought of the world knowing it. Helen looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, I request 50% of the asset division, alimony for the years of unpaid work, recognition of my client's intellectual contribution, and an investigation into the hiding of assets." The judge turned to Dr. Vance. "Does the defense wish to speak?" The lawyer tried to talk, but his tongue felt like lead. It was like trying to stop a hurricane with an umbrella. For the first time in years, Robert truly looked at Lucy. Not his wife, not the ornament, but the woman who was by his side when he was nobody, the woman who believed in him when no one else did. His voice came out small, broken. "I'm sorry." Lucy didn't smile. She didn't take revenge. She simply held his gaze with a dignity he could never buy. Helen closed the briefcase with a soft click. "Late wisdom, my son." She said it without hate, but with a coldness that hurt more than any scream. But justice does not wait for regret. 3 weeks before that hearing, Lucy Hayes had hit rock bottom in a way that only those who have lived it can understand. She lived in a tiny apartment on the outskirts of the city, a 300-square-foot space with walls that seemed to absorb the sunlight. The paint was peeling in the corners. The tile floor was uneven and creaked when she walked. The shower leaked and the refrigerator made a constant noise that kept her from sleeping well at night. She had found a job in a coffee shop near the train station. She served coffee, cleaned tables, smiled at customers who didn't even look her in the eye. The tips were small. The salary barely covered the rent and the minimum for food. One night, after an especially long shift, she arrived home with swollen feet and a sore back. She sat on the edge of the bed, her only bed, which also worked as a sofa, and opened the envelope she had been avoiding for days. It was Robert's final proposal, 2% of the assets, approximately $50,000, an amount that for many people would be significant, but for her represented 10 years of her life reduced to an insulting figure. The tears came without warning. They were not tears of sadness, but of anger, of helplessness, of feeling invisible. She had dedicated an entire decade to building Robert's life, not just keeping the house, not just being the perfect wife in public, but working, thinking, contributing. No one knew because she had never shouted it from the rooftops. But she knew, and that should have been enough. She remembered the first project Robert built, that project in New Jersey, that launched him to success. He had no capital. The banks wouldn't lend to him. It was she who took out the $80,000 she had saved by working for years in the supermarket, living on the minimum, dreaming of college. She gave them to him without thinking twice, because she believed in him, because she loved him. Robert signed a contract promising to pay her back with interest. He never did. And when she mentioned it, he laughed. "We are husband and wife, Lucy. There is no your money or my money. Everything is ours." But now that they were separating, it turned out that everything was his. Lucy closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The apartment smelled of dampness, of cheap food, of despair. Outside, the sirens of ambulances and police cars broke the silence of the night. This was her world now. This was the place where Robert had let her fall. But inside her, something was beginning to wake up, a voice that had been silenced for years, but had never completely died. This is not right. This is not fair. The next day, she used the little money she had left to print copies of all the documents she had kept in secret, emails, contracts, bank receipts, everything that proved she had been a fundamental part of Robert's success. Then, she did the hardest thing she had ever done in her life. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she had avoided for months. The phone rang 3 times before a voice answered. "Lucy." Helen Miller's voice sounded surprised, but not unpleasant. "Yes, Mrs. Miller, Helen." Lucy swallowed hard. "I know this is strange. I know you are his mother." But I need help. And I think you are the only person who can understand." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Lucy closed her eyes, waiting for rejection, mockery, the click of the call ending. But then Helen spoke, and her voice had an unexpected warmth. "Come to my house tomorrow. Bring all the documents you have. And Lucy," she paused. "Thank you for calling." Helen Miller lived in a high-rise in an elegant but discreet neighborhood. The apartment was full of books from floor to ceiling, shelves full of legal texts, classic novels, biographies of famous jurists. The walls were decorated with diplomas, old photographs, and some paintings by contemporary artists. When Lucy arrived that morning, Helen received her with freshly made coffee and a look that didn't judge. "Sit down." Helen pointed to a worn but comfortable leather sofa. "Tell me everything." And Lucy did. She talked for 2 hours without stopping. She told her about the $80,000, about the nights reviewing contracts, about the meetings where Robert asked for her opinion, and then took credit for the ideas as his own. She talked about the constant humiliation, about the poisonous phrases that made her feel small, about the secretary in Chicago. Helen listened in silence, taking occasional notes without interrupting. When Lucy finished, her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying. She had no more tears left. Helen placed her cup on the table with a smooth movement. "Do you know what the worst part of all this is?" Helen asked, looking at her intently. "That I saw it coming?" Lucy looked at her, confused. "I raised Robert alone after his father died." Helen leaned back on the sofa, and for the first time her face showed something like fatigue. "I worked double shifts so he wouldn't lack anything. I sent him to the best schools, and at some point, he stopped seeing the effort. He started to believe that everything came to him because he deserved it, not because someone had sacrificed something to give it to him." She paused, looking at her own hands. "When he met you, I thought you were good for him. You were humble, hard-working. You had your own dreams. I thought you would help him keep his feet on the ground." Helen shook her head. "But instead of learning from you, he crushed you. He turned you into what he needed you to be, invisible, quiet, grateful." "Why did you never say anything?" Lucy asked in a low voice. "Because a mother always wants to believe her son can change." Helen smiled bitterly. "And because he stopped talking to me 5 years ago when I told him that what he was doing to you was not right. He called me meddling. He told me I didn't understand anything about the modern world, that I was jealous of his success." She stood up and walked to the window, watching the street below. "But now I'm going to meddle." She turned to Lucy with determination. "I am going to represent you, and I promise you one thing. Robert is going to learn that there are consequences for his actions, not out of revenge, but out of justice." Lucy felt something expand in her chest. It wasn't exactly hope. It was something more solid. It was certainty. "I don't have money to pay you." Helen raised a hand. "I don't want your money. I want my son to understand what it means to respect another person." She approached and took Lucy's hands in hers. "And I want you to get back what is yours. Not just the money, Lucy. Your dignity, your voice, your future." The two women spent the following days preparing the case with surgical meticulousness. Helen reviewed every document, verified every date, contacted witnesses Lucy had forgotten existed. The architect who worked on the first project confirmed that Lucy was present in the planning meetings and contributed crucial ideas. The accountant found bank transfers that proved the initial loan. An investor remembered that Robert had explicitly told him that his wife had a better eye for business than he did. Helen built a case that left no room for doubt or interpretation. It was a wall of evidence, a legal arsenal that would turn the hearing into a professional execution. But more important than that, during those weeks, something changed in Lucy. Feeling seen again, heard, believed, was like waking up after a long, dark sleep. Helen was not just representing her legally, she was reminding her who she had been before Robert, and who she could be again. "You are brilliant, Lucy," Helen told her one afternoon while they reviewed documents. "You always were. And that is exactly what my son could not stand." After that first hearing, Robert didn't sleep for 3 nights in a row. He stayed awake in his mansion, that huge house with 6 bedrooms that now seemed like an empty tomb to him. He walked through the hallways like a ghost, touching the designer furniture that had once given him so much pride and that now seemed like just meaningless objects. Everything Helen had said was true. Lucy's $80,000 were the base of his entire empire. Without that initial money, he never would have been able to start. The banks didn't trust him. Investors saw him as too young, too inexperienced. But Lucy had trusted, and he had taken that trust and turned it into a cage. "Doctor," Vance called him on the 3rd day. "Robert, we need to talk." His voice sounded tense. "Helen Miller is not playing. She has everything. Absolutely everything. If this goes to a full trial, you won't just lose 50%. You could face charges for financial fraud." Robert ran a hand over his face. He had lost weight. The dark circles under his eyes looked like bruises. "What do you recommend?" "Negotiate, now, before it's too late." Vance paused. "And Robert, I need to ask you something. Why did you never tell me your mother was Helen Miller?" "Because we haven't spoken in years." "Well, she's speaking now, and let me tell you something. In 30 years of career, I have never seen anyone prepare a case like she has done. It's like watching a master at work. Every detail, every date, every comma is perfectly placed. There are no cracks." Robert hung up the phone and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in his adult life, he felt completely helpless. He had always been able to buy solutions, intimidate adversaries, use his money and his position as weapons. But against his own mother, against the truth, there were no weapons that worked. He remembered a conversation from years ago. He was 25. He had just closed his first major deal. He arrived at Helen's house with a bottle of expensive champagne, full of euphoria. "Mom, I did it. I'm someone." Helen had smiled, but there was something sad in that smile. "You were always someone, Robert. You didn't need money for that." "Of course I did," Robert had answered with the arrogance of youth. "Money is the only thing that matters. It's what makes people respect you." "No, son. Money makes people fear you or flatter you. Respect is earned another way." But he hadn't listened. He never listened. The second hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. This time, Robert arrived alone. He had fired 2 of the 3 lawyers after they presented him with an astronomical bill for work that, according to Helen, was incompetent. Only Dr. Vance remained, and he looked like a condemned man. Lucy entered with Helen, and this time there was something different about her. She walked taller. The dress she wore was simple but dignified. There was color in her cheeks. Her eyes no longer avoided anyone's gaze. The judge reviewed the documents Helen had presented. "Dr. Miller, this evidence is exhaustive." The judge took off his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief. "Mr. Miller, does the defense have anything to add?" Dr. Vance stood up with effort. "Your Honor, my client recognizes the validity of the documents presented. He recognizes that there was an initial financial contribution by Ms. Hayes. However, we argue that said contribution was already compensated through the lifestyle she enjoyed during the marriage." Helen stood up without hurry, with that calm that preceded earthquakes. "Compensated?" She repeated the word as if it were poison. "Your Honor, my client dropped out of her university studies at the express request of Mr. Miller. She gave up any possibility of her own professional career. For 10 years she worked as an unpaid legal reviewer, saving her husband's company from multiple lawsuits due to poor contract clauses." She opened another folder. "I have here testimonies from 3 outside lawyers who confirmed that Lucy Hayes reviewed contracts and found errors that the hired professionals had missed. One of them stated, and I quote, "Without Ms. Hayes, the Miller Construction Company would have gone bankrupt in the 2nd year due to contract lawsuits." Robert closed his eyes. It was true. All of it was true. He remembered those nights where he panicked because a contract didn't close, and Lucy sat with him at the dining table, reading every line with infinite patience until she found the problem. "Here, Robert. This clause makes you responsible for damages you can't control. You have to change it." And the next day at the office, he presented the solution as his own idea. Helen continued, relentless. Additionally, the lifestyle that my client supposedly enjoyed came with a price: social isolation, abandonment of her personal ambitions, and a systematic campaign of psychological devaluation. I have emails where Mr. Miller refers to his wife as my free personal secretary in conversations with friends. A murmur went through the room. Even the judge frowned. "Is that true, Mr. Miller?" Robert wanted to deny it. He wanted to say it was a joke, that the words were taken out of context. But his mother's look paralyzed him. It was a look that said, "One more lie and I destroy you completely." "Yes," his voice came out as barely a whisper. "It's true." The silence that followed was devastating. Helen sat back down, satisfied. "Your Honor, I request that a final hearing be scheduled to determine not only the asset division, but also compensation for moral damages and the possibility of Mr. Miller facing charges for fraud and hiding of assets." The judge nodded. "Final hearing scheduled for 1 month from now. Mr. Miller, I strongly suggest you consider reaching an out-of-court settlement. This case does not look good for you." When everyone left, Robert stayed sitting in the empty room. Dr. Vance approached cautiously. "Robert, you have to negotiate. If this continues—" "I know." Robert ran his hands through his hair. "I know." Outside, in the hallway, Helen and Lucy were walking toward the exit when Robert caught up with them. "Mum," his voice sounded broken, "can we talk? The three of us?" Helen looked at Lucy, who nodded slowly. The three sat in a coffee shop near the courthouse. It was a simple place, with scratched wooden tables and a persistent smell of reheated coffee. Nothing to do with the elegant restaurants where Robert used to close deals. Robert stirred his coffee without tasting it. "I don't even know where to start." "Start with the truth," Helen said firmly. "No excuses, no justifications." Robert looked up at Lucy. He really looked at her, maybe for the first time in years. "I'm sorry." The words came out shaky. "I'm so sorry. I have no excuse for what I did, for how I treated you. I turned you into something small to feel big. I stole your voice so mine would sound louder and—" His voice broke. "And the worst is that I always knew you were better than me. Smarter, more honest, more— everything." Lucy listened to him without expression. There was no forgiveness on her face, but no hate either, just a kind of distant sadness. "Why?" she asked in a low voice. "Why was it so important for you to make me feel like I was worth nothing?" Robert swallowed. "Because I was afraid," he admitted, and the words seemed to be pulled from a deep place. "Afraid that if you shone, I would disappear. Afraid that everyone would see that without you, I was nothing special. So I turned you off. I hid you. I made you believe you needed me, when in reality, it was I who needed you." Helen watched her son with a mix of disappointment and something like compassion. "Fear does not justify cruelty, Robert." "I know." Robert clenched his fists. "I know, Mom. And I understand if you never forgive me, Lucy. I understand if you want me to pay every last cent. I deserve it." Lucy took a sip of her coffee. When she spoke, her voice was clear, firm. "I don't want revenge, Robert. I never wanted it. I just want what is fair. I want it to be recognized that I also built that I wasn't just an ornament on your arm, and I want to be able to rebuild my life without having to beg." "You will have it." Robert nodded. "Everything your lawyer asks for. Your lawyer." He almost laughed at the irony. "I accept everything. The 50%, the compensation, everything. I just need you to know that I'm sorry for ruining everything." Helen intervened. "Robert, regret is a beginning. But it doesn't erase the damage. You are going to sign an agreement where Lucy receives what corresponds to her, and you are going to do it without complaining, without trying to negotiate down, without legal tricks. Understood?" "Understood." The agreement was signed 3 weeks later in a notary office downtown. There was no drama, no shouting, only papers, signatures, and the sound of a life being divided into legal paragraphs. Lucy received 50% of the assets built during the marriage, which included properties, company shares, and investment funds. The total amount was almost $8 million. She also received an additional $500,000 for moral damages and unpaid work. When the notary finished reading the figures, Lucy stayed in silence. It wasn't the amount that impacted her, it was the recognition. It was that, finally, someone with authority had said out loud, "Yes, you contributed. Yes, your work had value. Yes, you deserved more." Robert signed every page without reading. He no longer cared about the money. He had discovered something that his arrogance had never allowed him to see, that all the money in the world didn't compensate for the loss of respect, and he had lost the respect of the two most important women in his life. After the signing, Helen and Lucy went out together. The sun was shining brightly, and for the first time in months Lucy felt she could breathe completely. "Now what?" Helen asked with a small smile. "Now." Lucy took a deep breath. "Now I go back to study. I'm going to finish the law degree I left 10 years ago." Helen put a hand on her shoulder. "You are going to be an excellent lawyer, and if you ever need help or a place to do an internship, my office is always open for you." Lucy felt her eyes fill with tears, but this time they were different tears. They were tears of gratitude, of liberation, of a new beginning. "Thank you for everything, for believing in me when no one else did, for fighting for me when I no longer had strength." "I didn't fight for you, Lucy," Helen said softly. "I fought with you. There is a difference. You already had the strength. You just needed someone to remind you where it was." The two women hugged on that sidewalk under the sun, while life continued to flow around them. The first months after the agreement were strange for Lucy. She had money, but she didn't really know what to do with it. For so long she had lived on the minimum that abundance seemed almost immoral. She moved to a small but bright apartment in a nice neighborhood. She didn't want luxury, she didn't want flashiness. She wanted a space that was hers, where every piece of furniture, every painting, every cup of coffee was her own choice and not an imposition. She painted the walls in light colors. She bought plants and learned to care for them. She placed shelves for the law books she started to buy. Every small decision was an act of reclaiming her own life. In September, she enrolled in the university to resume her studies. She was 42 years old and she was a student again. The first day when she entered the classroom, she felt all the eyes on her. Most of her classmates were 20 years old. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with something like pity. But Lucy sat in the front row, opened her new notebook, and smiled to herself. She didn't care what they thought. She had spent too much time worrying about other people's opinions. The civil law professor, a man about 50 years old with a grey beard and intelligent eyes, asked a difficult question about contract liability. The class stayed in silence. No one raised their hand. Lucy took a deep breath and raised hers. "Yes, Miss Hayes, Lucy Hayes." She stood up. "I believe the answer has to do with the interpretation of the good faith clause that the Civil Code establishes." She spoke for 2 minutes, articulating complex arguments with a clarity that surprised the professor and the whole class. When she finished, the professor nodded slowly. "Excellent. Absolutely excellent. Have you studied law before, Ms. Hayes?" "I started many years ago," Lucy answered with a smile, "but I had to leave it. Now I'm back." "I'm glad you did. You clearly have a talent for this." After class, some students approached her with curiosity. A young girl with curly hair asked her, "Why did you decide to go back to study now?" Lucy thought about the answer for a moment. "Because I finally understood that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be." While Lucy rebuilt her life, Robert faced the ruins of his. The news of his divorce and the circumstances surrounding it leaked into his social circle. The city is big, but power circles are small. The story of how his own mother had represented his ex-wife and exposed his behavior became the favorite gossip at elegant dinners and business cocktails. Partners started to look at him differently. Invitations to important events became scarce. Some important clients withdrew contracts, not because they doubted his technical abilities, but because they no longer wanted to be associated with someone considered unethical. Robert tried to call Helen several times. She never answered. One afternoon, desperate, he went to her apartment. He rang the bell insistently until she opened the door. She wore a comfortable sweater and reading glasses. She looked at him with a neutral expression. "What do you want, Robert?" "To talk. Just talk." His voice sounded tired. "I know I don't deserve it, but you are my mother." Helen sighed and stepped aside to let him in. They sat in the living room, that space full of books that Robert had ignored for years. Helen served 2 cups of tea without asking. "5 minutes," she said. "You have 5 minutes." Robert joined his hands, looking for the right words. "All my life you have been the strongest person I know. When Dad died, you kept going. You worked impossible shifts, you never complained, you never broke down. And I always wanted to be that strong. But I confused strength with hardness. I thought being strong meant not needing anyone, not showing weakness, not letting anyone affect me." Helen drank her tea in silence, listening. "And when I met Lucy, when I saw that she was good, generous, intelligent, it scared me. Because if I let her shine, everyone would see that I wasn't that special, that I wasn't like you. So I turned her into something small so I wouldn't feel small myself." "And now," Helen asked, "what have you learned now?" "That true strength is not crushing others." Robert looked up. "It's lifting them up. That being strong is not needing anyone. It's knowing when to ask for help. And that I've been a coward all my life, hiding behind money and arrogance, because I was terrified that someone would see who I really was." Helen placed her cup on the table. "Son, I've been waiting years for you to say that. Years watching you turn into someone I didn't recognize. Someone who measured his value in bank accounts and properties, not in principles or love." "I'm sorry, Mum." Robert felt the tears starting to fall. "I'm sorry for disappointing you. I'm sorry for ignoring everything you tried to teach me, and I'm so sorry for hurting Lucy." Helen stood up and sat next to him. For the first time in years, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Regret is the first step, Robert, but it's not enough. You have to become someone different, someone better, and that takes time, effort, and humility. Will you help me?" Helen looked at him for a long time. "I can't do the work for you, but yes, I will be here, because that's what mothers do. They don't abandon their children, but they don't allow them to keep destroying lives either." 6 months after the agreement, Lucy was walking through a park near the university when she saw Robert sitting on a bench. He looked thinner, with his hair a little longer, without that flash of arrogance he used to wear like a suit. He was feeding pigeons with breadcrumbs, something the Robert she knew would never have done. Lucy hesitated. She could turn around and pretend she hadn't seen him, but something stopped her. Maybe curiosity, maybe the need to close a chapter completely. She approached slowly. "Hello, Robert." He looked up, surprised. He stood up awkwardly, dropping the bread. "Lucy, I didn't expect to see you." "I study nearby." She pointed toward the university. "Can I sit down?" "Please." They sat with a careful space between them. The pigeons continued pecking at the ground, indifferent to the emotional weight of the moment. "You look good," Robert said finally. "Different." "I feel different." Lucy smiled slightly. "I'm finishing the degree. I'm doing well. It's strange to be happy." "I'm glad, truly." Robert looked at his own hands. "I've been working on myself. Therapy, reading, trying to understand why I was so destructive." "And have you found answers?" "Some. Nothing that justifies what I did, but at least I understand why." He paused. "My therapist says I spent years building an image of myself that didn't stand on anything real. And every time you threatened that image just by being intelligent, capable, better than me, I reacted by destroying you instead of accepting my own insecurity." Lucy listened to him without interrupting. "I don't expect your forgiveness," Robert continued. "I know I don't deserve it, but I want you to know that I've changed. Or at least I'm trying. I've sold part of the company, I've reduced my lifestyle, I'm donating money to causes that help women in situations of economic abuse." "Why are you telling me this?" Lucy asked. "Because I need you to know that what you did by reporting me, by demanding justice, it didn't just save you, It saved me, too. You forced me to look in the mirror and see the monster I had become." Lucy took a deep breath. "I'm glad you're better, Robert, truly. But it wasn't my responsibility to save you, and it isn't now. Everyone has to do their own work." "I know," Robert nodded. "I just wanted you to know that your courage changed lives, mine included." They stayed in silence for a long time, watching the sun start to go down. Finally, Lucy stood up. "Take care, Robert. I hope you find the peace you're looking for. You too, Lucy. And thank you for facing me, for not giving up." Lucy nodded and walked away, feeling a weight she didn't know she still carried release from her shoulders. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was simply closure. 2 years after the divorce, Lucy graduated with honors from law school. Helen was in the front row during the ceremony, clapping with pride while Lucy received her diploma. "I knew you would do it," Helen told her later, hugging her. "I always knew you had this inside you." "I wouldn't have done it without you." "Nonsense. I only reminded you of what you already knew." Lucy started working in Helen's office, specializing in matrimonial law and cases of economic abuse. Her first client was a woman named Carmen, 53 years old, who had dedicated 30 years of her life to a husband who now wanted to leave her with nothing. Lucy listened to her story and saw her own reflection in every word. "I know exactly how you feel," she told her, "and I promise you we are going to fight. You are going to receive what corresponds to you." And she fought. With the same ferocity Helen had shown for her, Lucy became a relentless advocate for invisible women. She won cases that seemed impossible, found evidence where others saw nothing, built arguments that judges could not ignore. Her reputation grew. Clients arrived from all over the country, recommended by other women who had recovered their lives thanks to her. And every time she won a case, Lucy thought of that version of herself that had entered the courthouse years ago, alone, scared, but not defeated. One afternoon, Helen and Lucy were having coffee in the office after a long day. "Do you know what the most ironic part is?" Lucy said. "Robert tried to destroy my dreams of being a lawyer, and by doing so, he gave me the personal experience I needed to be the best possible lawyer for women like me." Helen smiled. "The universe has a peculiar sense of humor. Have you heard anything from him?" Lucy asked. "A little. He continues in therapy. He sold most of his properties. He lives in a modest apartment. He works less, donates more." Helen paused. "I think he is finally learning what it means to be human. I'm glad for him, truly." And Lucy said it sincerely. She didn't feel resentment. She didn't feel hate. Only a kind of distant peace, the recognition that some people have to destroy themselves completely to be able to rebuild. 5 years after the divorce, Lucy published a book titled Invisible: The Legal Fight Against Economic Abuse in Marriage. The book combined legal analysis with personal testimonies from women who had gone through similar situations, including fragments of her own story. The book became a success, not because it was sensationalist, but because it was honest, because it showed the reality of thousands of women whose work, contributions and sacrifices were made invisible and devalued. The book presentation was held in a bookstore downtown. The room was full. Women of all ages, some men too, journalists, law students, activists. Lucy went up to the small stage with her hands shaking slightly. She looked at the audience and saw Helen in the third row, smiling with pride. "When I was young, I dreamed of being a lawyer," Lucy started. "I wanted to defend those who had no voice. I wanted justice to be more than a pretty word. But I abandoned that dream because someone convinced me it wasn't important, that my value was in being a complement to another person, not in being myself." She paused, watching the attentive faces. "For 10 years, I worked in silence. I contributed ideas, money, time, intelligence, and it was all attributed to another person. I became invisible. And the worst was not the economic injustice. The worst was starting to believe I was invisible too." Her voice broke slightly, but she continued with firmness. "This book is not just my story. It's the story of millions of women whose domestic, Emotional and intellectual work never appears on any payroll, is never counted in any balance, is never recognized in any resume. Women who built empires alongside their partners and then were discarded as if they had contributed nothing. The applause started softly and grew until it filled the whole room. Lucy felt the tears in her eyes but didn't hold them back. She no longer had to hide her emotions. She no longer had to be perfect. After the presentation, dozens of women approached her. Some told her their stories. Others simply thanked her for giving them the words they hadn't been able to find. An older woman, about 70 years old, took her hands in hers. "I lived that 40 years ago. No one believed me then. Everyone told me I should be grateful for what my husband gave me." The woman's eyes shone. "I wish I had had your courage. I wish I had had someone like you." Lucy squeezed her hands gently. "It's never too late to recognize your own value. Never." When the crowd dispersed, Helen approached. The two women hugged in silence, a hug that contained years of struggle, of mutual trust, of battles won together. "I am very proud of you," Helen whispered. "This is as much yours as it is mine," Lucy answered. "You taught me that justice is not just what the law says, it's what we do with it." That night, while Lucy was signing the last copies, she saw a familiar figure at the back of the bookstore. Robert was there, standing by a shelf with a copy of the book in his hands. Lucy hesitated a moment, but then walked toward him. Robert looked up when she approached. His eyes no longer had that arrogant flash. There was something different in him, something that looked like genuine humility. "I read it," Robert said, showing the book. "Twice. And you're right. About everything." He closed the book carefully. "I've spent the last years trying to understand how I could be so blind, so cruel. This book helped me see it from your perspective, from the perspective of all the women I did the same to without realizing it." Lucy crossed her arms, not defensively, but observingly. "Without realizing it? I don't know if it was that unconscious, Robert." "You're right," he admitted. "I always knew what I was doing. I just convinced myself it was justified, that that's how the world worked." He paused. "But the world only works that way because men like me allow it." "And what have you done about it?" Robert took a deep breath. "In addition to therapy, I've started giving talks, in companies, in universities. I talk about toxic masculinity, about how men can be complicit in abuse without even realizing it. It's not much, but it's what I can do." Lucy studied him for a long moment. She could see he wasn't lying. The change was real, although slow, although imperfect. "I'm glad you're doing that work," she finally said. "Not for me, but for all the women who might cross your path in the future. I'm never going to be able to repair the damage I did to you." Robert's voice was barely a whisper. "But I want you to know that every day I try to be better than the man I was. That's the only thing you can do." Lucy put a hand on his shoulder briefly. "Be better today than yesterday." Robert nodded, his eyes wet. "Thank you, Lucy, for everything. For not giving up, for fighting, for showing us all that things can change." Lucy gave him one last look before walking away. "Things don't change by themselves, Robert. We change them. When we choose dignity over comfort, when we choose justice over silence." 7 years after the day Lucy had entered that courtroom alone, she found herself again in a courtroom. But this time it was different. This time she was on the other side, standing next to a woman named Monica, who was shaking slightly while waiting for the hearing to start. Monica was 38 years old and had dedicated 15 years of her life to a marriage where her work as an unpaid administrator of her husband's businesses was never recognized. When he decided to divorce to marry a younger woman, he offered her barely 5%. Lucy had reviewed every document, every email, every bank transaction. She had found what she always found: the invisible footprint of a woman whose work had been systematically erased from the official narrative. "Are you ready?" Lucy asked Monica softly. "I'm scared," Monica admitted. "He has 5 lawyers. I only have you." Lucy smiled with that smile she had learned from Helen, that smile that said, "Trust me. One is enough when it's the right one." The hearing started exactly as Lucy remembered from her own experience. Monica's husband, a construction businessman named Albert Ross, entered with his group of expensive lawyers, all in flawless suits, all with that air of superiority that Lucy knew so well. The lead lawyer started his argument, the same one Lucy had heard dozens of times in similar cases. The wife had not contributed financially, she had enjoyed a high lifestyle. She should be grateful for what was offered to her. When it was Lucy's turn, she stood up with the calm she had perfected over years. She opened her briefcase, the same briefcase Helen had given her when she graduated, and pulled out the first folder. Your Honor, my client, Ms. Monica Miller, did not just contribute to the family assets. She was the backbone of the entire business operation. She placed a document on the table. For 15 years, she handled the accounting, the payroll, the tax filings, and the legal correspondence of 3 companies, without an official title, without a salary, without recognition. Albert's lawyer tried to interrupt, but the judge, and a man who had seen Lucy's cases before, raised a hand. Let the lawyer finish, Lucy continued, her voice clear and firm. I have here sworn statements from 4 outside accountants who confirm that Ms. Miller performed professional work at an expert level. I have emails where Mr. Ross refers to her as my personal accountant. I have testimonies from employees who confirmed that she solved problems that the hired professionals could not solve. One by one, Lucy placed the documents on the judge's table. It was a perfect arsenal, an impeccable legal construction. It was exactly what Helen had done for her years ago. Additionally, I have evidence that Mr. Ross hid assets during the last 2 years, anticipating the divorce. Offshore bank accounts, properties in the names of others, undeclared investments. Albert's face turned pale. His lawyers started whispering to each other with urgency. Lucy looked directly at Albert, and in that moment she didn't see just him. She saw Robert. She saw all the men who had built fortunes on the invisible work of women, who had enjoyed success while erasing half of the equation. Your Honor, I request 60% of the assets for my client, given her proven contribution and the attempted financial fraud by Mr. Ross. I also request compensation for unpaid work and moral damages. The judge reviewed the documents for several minutes. The silence in the room was absolute. Monica squeezed her hands on her lap, holding her breath. Finally, the judge spoke. Dr. Hayes, this documentation is an extraordinarily exhaustive. Mr. Ross, does your defense wish to respond to these accusations? Albert's lawyers looked at each other. The led one tried to argue, but his words sounded hollow against the mountain of evidence Lucy had presented. 3 hours later, Albert signed an agreement. Monica would receive 55% of the assets, plus additional compensation. It wasn't exactly what Lucy had asked for, but it was justice. When they left the courthouse, Monica broke down in tears in Lucy's arms. I can't believe we won. I can't believe someone finally believed me. Lucy hugged her hard, feeling the weight of all the battles she had fought, all the women she had helped to recover their voices. I was always going to believe you, she told her softly, because I was also where you are, and someone believed me. That night, Lucy had dinner with Helen at the restaurant where they had celebrated her graduation. The 2 women toasted with red wine, smiling with the satisfaction of another battle won. You have surpassed the teacher, Helen said with a flash of pride in her eyes. You already win cases that I wouldn't have been able to win. That's because you taught me well. Lucy raised her glass. And because every time I enter a courthouse, I carry with me the memory of what it was like to be on the other side. That makes me a better lawyer than I could have been if everything had been easy. Helen nodded pensively. You know, I've been thinking about retiring soon. I'm 75 years old, it's time. She looked at Lucy with a smile. But I stay calm knowing there are lawyers like you, fighting the battles that matter. I will never be able to thank you enough for what you did for me. Don't thank me. Helen extended her hand over the table and Lucy took it. What I did was give you the tools, but the fight, the courage, the determination, that was always in you. I only reminded you that it was there. The 2 women stayed in silence for a moment, enjoying the food, the company, the mutual recognition that they had changed lives together. Have you ever spoken to Robert again? Helen asked. Occasionally. Lucy took a sip of wine. He sends me messages sometimes, telling me about his awareness work. We don't respond much, but I think he is genuinely trying to be better. I hope he achieves it. Helen sighed. As a mother, you never stop wishing your children find their way. Although the way has to go through recognizing their own mistakes. He will find it, Lucy said with conviction, because he is finally doing the work of looking at himself without excuses. When Lucy returned to her apartment that night, she sat at her desk and opened her laptop. She had a new case waiting for her, a 52-year-old woman who had been a silent partner in a family business for 30 years and was now being excluded from the profit distribution. Lucy smiled as she read the details. She knew exactly how to handle this. She knew where to look, what questions to ask, how to build the case that would return to that woman what corresponded to her. Before starting to work, she looked at the photo she had on her desk. It was from her graduation day with Helen by her side, both smiling. Next to it was another photo, one of her alone, the day she signed her divorce, with red eyes but her chin up. Two versions of herself. The one that had been destroyed and the one that had resurged. And between both photographs, all the cases won, all the women helped, all the lives rebuilt. Lucy started to write. She had work to do. She had justice to impart. She had voices to amplify. And she would never, never be invisible again. 10 years after that first hearing, Lucy Hayes was invited to give a lecture at the university, in the same law school where she had completed her degree. The auditorium was packed with law students, professors, practicing lawyers, and journalists. There were also women who had read her book, who had followed her cases in the media, who saw in her a reflection of their own battles. The topic was matrimonial justice and recognition of invisible work. But everyone knew Lucy wouldn't just come to talk about legal theory. She would come to talk about life, survival, transformation. Lucy waited behind the stage, feeling the familiar mix of nerves and determination. Helen was by her side, adjusting her dress collar like a mother prepares her daughter before an important moment. "Nervous?" Helen asked with a soft smile. "Always," Lucy admitted. "But it's a different nervousness. It's no longer fear of not being enough. It's responsibility. There are women out there who need to hear that it's possible. And you are the living proof that it is." Lucy went up to the stage in a simple navy blue dress, her hair now with some grey she didn't try to hide, her eyes shining with the confidence of someone who has fought 1,000 battles and knows she can fight 1,000 more. The applause received her before she said a single word. 10 years ago I entered a courtroom completely alone, she started, her clear voice echoing through the auditorium. No lawyer, no money, no apparent hope. My ex-husband laughed at me. His 3 lawyers laughed at me. At that moment I was invisible to them, or so they thought. She paused, letting the words settle in every heart present. But there is a huge difference between being invisible and being ignored. I was not invisible. I never was. I was deliberately ignored. And that difference changes everything, because what is invisible cannot be seen, but what is ignored simply waits for the right moment to be recognized. The screens behind her showed statistics, the percentage of women who perform unpaid domestic work, the economic value of that work if it were paid, the cases of economic abuse in divorces, the hours invested in care that never appear in any official accounting. Invisible work does not exist because it is truly invisible, Lucy continued, walking slowly across the stage. It exists because there are people who benefit greatly from not seeing it, because recognizing it would mean redistributing power, wealth, credit, recognition. And power, ladies and gentlemen, is never redistributed voluntarily. You have to demand it, you have to document it, you have to fight for it. Several women in the audience nodded with shining eyes. Lucy could see their own stories reflected in those faces. During 10 years of marriage, I contributed $80,000 that were never returned to me. I reviewed contracts that saved a company from multiple bankruptcies. I made financial decisions that generated millions in profits. I worked full shifts without rest, without salary, without recognition. And when I asked for a divorce, when I finally said enough, they offered me 2%. 2%. Her voice rose slightly, not with anger, but with the strength of truth. Why? Because my work, by not having a salary attached, by not being on an official payroll, by not having a title printed on a business card, simply didn't count. It was as if those 10 years had never existed, as if I were a guest in my own life. A murmur of indignation went through the auditorium. Many students took notes frantically, others simply listened with absolute attention. I was lucky. Lucy pointed toward where Helen was sitting in the front row, and her voice softened with genuine gratitude. I had someone who believed in me when no one else did. Someone who gave me the tools to fight. Someone who reminded me that I had a right to justice. But how many women don't have that luck? How many remain in the shadow because no one tells them they have a right to come out into the light? The presentation continued for almost an hour. Lucy talked about specific cases without revealing names, about legal strategies she had developed, about how to build evidence when the whole system is designed to ignore certain types of contributions. She talked about the letters she received, about the women who had recovered their lives after reading her book, about the slow but real changes in the country's law. But more than legal technicalities, she talked about dignity. Dignity is not something they give you, she said toward the end, her voice acquiring an intensity that made the entire auditorium hold its breath. It's something you recognize in yourself first. I didn't get my dignity back when I won the case. I already had it. I always had it, even when I lived in that tiny apartment, when I served coffees to survive, when I cried with helplessness at night. The dignity was there, waiting for me to reclaim it. She stopped in the center of the stage. What I got back by fighting was not dignity. It was something more. I got my voice back. I got back the right to occupy space in the world. I got back the certainty that my story deserved to be told, my work deserved to be recognized, my life deserved to be lived fully. When she finished, the auditorium exploded. People stood up as if moved by a spring. The applause was deafening, long, loaded with emotion. Lucy saw tears on many faces, determination on others, that spark of recognition that said, I have also lived this, I can also fight. During the question session, hands went up by the dozens. A young student, no more than 25 years old, with a shaky voice, asked, Dr. Hayes, how did you find the strength to keep going? When everything seemed lost, when you were alone and scared, where did you get the courage? Lucy smiled with tenderness, seeing in that young girl the woman she herself had been. I didn't get the courage from any magic place. It was always inside me, as it is inside you, as it is inside everyone here. But I did have to choose to see it. I had to choose to believe, even when everything told me the opposite, that I deserved justice, that my life had value, that it wasn't too late to become who I was meant to be. She paused. True courage is not having fear. It's having fear, feeling that fear in every cell of your body, and still taking a step forward. Another hand went up, a man about 30 years old with a serious expression. Did you ever forgive your ex-husband? And if you did, how did you get to that point? The room stayed in an expectant silence, waiting for the answer. It was the question everyone wanted to ask, but few dared to. Lucy thought carefully before speaking, because she knew her words had weight, that there were women in that room looking for answers for their own lives. Forgiveness is a tremendously complicated word, she started slowly. I don't feel resentment toward Robert. I don't wish him ill. I don't wake up in the mornings thinking about revenge. I have seen how he has worked during these years to genuinely change, and I respect that effort because I know how hard it is to transform yourself. She took a deep breath. But to forgive does not mean to forget. It does not mean to say that what happened was fine or acceptable. It does not mean that we should trust again or allow that person to occupy a space in our lives again. To forgive, for me, simply meant letting go of the weight. It means I no longer carry the responsibility for his mistake. He has to carry that. I chose to walk free. After the lecture, dozens of people formed a long line to talk to Lucy. Women who told her their stories through tears, who showed her photos of their children and told her, I'm fighting for them. Young men who thanked her for opening their eyes to realities they had ignored. Students who told her with shining eyes that they wanted to specialize in family law because she had shown them they could change the world, one case at a time. In the crowd, toward the end, Lucy saw a familiar figure waiting patiently, almost hidden behind others. When everyone left, when the room was almost empty, Robert approached slowly, with hesitant steps. 10 years had passed since the divorce. Robert was now 52 years old. Grey hair had invaded not only his temples, but much of his hair. Small wrinkles surrounded his eyes and his mouth. He had lost weight, but not in a sickly way. He just seemed more real, more human. The arrogance that once defined him had been replaced by something that looked a lot like genuine humility. "Hello, Lucy." His voice was soft, almost timid. "Robert." Lucy greeted him with a polite but not cold smile. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I come to all your lectures," he admitted, looking briefly at the ground before finding her eyes. "I always stay at the back in the last rows. I don't want to make you uncomfortable or take away your spotlight, but I need to hear you. I need to constantly remember." "Remember what?" "The real cost of my arrogance, the deep damage I caused, the extraordinary person I almost destroyed completely." Robert paused, struggling with the words. "And I need to remember that real change is possible, no matter how far you have fallen, because you are the living proof of it. If you could get up from where I let you fall, then I can at least try to be better." Lucy studied him for a long moment. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the weight he carried on his shoulders. "I have heard that you continue with your awareness work about masculinity and abuse." "Yes." Robert nodded. "I talk in companies, in high schools, in men's groups, in rehabilitation programs. I tell them my full story, without omitting anything, without smoothing the edges. I tell them how privilege blinded me, how arrogance turned me into an abuser, without me recognizing it because it was convenient for me not to see it. I show them the real consequences of ignoring the work and the value of another person." He paused, looking at her directly. "It's not much compared to the damage I caused. It will never be enough, but it's what I can do. It's my way of trying so other men don't make the same mistakes." "It's important," Lucy said sincerely, "very important, because men need to hear it from other men. They need to see that changing is not weakness, that recognizing your mistakes doesn't make you less of a man. On the contrary, it makes you more human." Robert nodded, his eyes shining with contained emotion. "Do you know what the most ironic part of all this is? For years I thought losing you was my biggest failure, the failure that defined me. But now I understand it was my biggest opportunity. The opportunity to stop being a mediocre man hidden behind money and become someone with real substance. To use my privilege to build instead of to destroy." Lucy felt a complex mix of emotions. It wasn't full forgiveness, but it was recognition of genuine effort. "I'm glad you see it that way, Robert. We all deserve second chances in this life, but only if we do the real work of deserving them, only if we look in the mirror without lying. I try every day." Robert hesitated a moment. "Thank you, Lucy. For your strength, for your example, for showing that it's possible to rebuild yourself, for not giving up when it would have been much easier to disappear." Lucy gave him one last look, a look that contained forgiveness without forgetting, closure without resentment, peace without need for reconciliation. "Take care, Robert. Keep doing the work. The world needs more men willing to look at themselves honestly." When he left, Helen approached Lucy with slow steps. Age weighed more on her now, but her spirit was still indomitable. "That was very generous of you," Helen commented, watching Robert's back as he walked away. "It wasn't generosity. It was justice." Lucy linked her arm with Helen's as they walked toward the exit. "He is doing the genuine work of changing, of being better, and that deserves recognition, although it doesn't erase what happened or restore what was lost." The two women went out of the building into the night. The air was cool, the streets were lit with warm lights, the city vibrated with its particular energy after dark. Students passed by, chatting excitedly. Couples walked hugging. Life continued its eternal course. "Do you know what the most beautiful thing about all this is?" Helen said, while they walked slowly, enjoying the night air. "That you didn't just change your own life. You changed the whole system piece by piece. Case by case, woman by woman, you are rebuilding the way society understands matrimonial justice." "We," Lucy corrected firmly. We are rebuilding it. You started this path long before me, Helen. You were a pioneer when no one else dared. But you are taking it infinitely further. Helen squeezed her arm with affection. And when I'm no longer here, I know with absolute certainty that you will continue, and you will train other brilliant lawyers who will continue after you. That is the true legacy, not what we do, but what we inspire in others. They arrived at their favorite cafe, that small discreet place where they had celebrated victories and comforted defeats for years. They sat by the window, ordered hot tea and apple pie, and simply enjoyed the present moment. "Do you ever regret it?" Helen asked suddenly, with that frankness that characterized them. "Fighting so publicly, exposing everything. I know it was painful, that there were dark moments." Lucy shook her head without a second of doubt. Not for a single second. Because if I hadn't fought, I would still be invisible. I would still believe my value depended on the validation of others. The fight gave me back to myself. It reminded me who I was before someone told me who I should be. That is exactly the right answer. Helen smiled with deep satisfaction. Because in the end, Lucy, we don't fight just for money or properties or legal recognition. We fight for something infinitely more valuable. "What do we fight for?" Lucy asked, although she already knew the answer in her heart. "For dignity." Helen raised her cup in a silent toast, her eyes shining with the wisdom of decades. "For the fundamental and unalienable right of every human being to be seen, heard, valued. For the absolute certainty that our lives matter, our work counts, our voices deserve to echo in the world." Lucy clinked her cup gently against Helen's. "For dignity, today, tomorrow, and always." The two women drank their tea in a comfortable and deep silence, that silence that only exists between people who have shared real battles. Outside, the city continued its eternal rhythm, indifferent and beautiful. They had fought together. They had won together. And they had proven once and again that justice, when pursued with unshakable courage and absolute determination, always finds its way. When Lucy returned to her apartment that night, she stood by the large window in her living room, watching the city lights extend to the horizon like a sea of ground stars. She thought of the woman she had been 10 years ago, scared, vulnerable, but never defeated. She thought of all the women she had helped since then, in all the lives that had changed. She thought of the ones she would come to help tomorrow and the day after, and all the days she had left. And she knew with a certainty as solid as mountains that she had found her true purpose in this world. It wasn't just winning cases or accumulating legal victories in an impressive file. It wasn't fame or recognition or even money. It was something much deeper. It was reminding the world once after another tirelessly that no contribution is too small to be recognized, no person is too ordinary to be extraordinary, no life is too simple to have absolute dignity. Because dignity is not bought with money, it is not sold in the market, it is not negotiated in court. Dignity simply is. It exists in every person, waiting to be recognized, reclaimed, defended. And once a person discovers it in themselves, once they light that inner flame that says, "I'm worth it, I matter, I deserve," no one, absolutely no one in this world, can ever take it away from them.